My name is Sarah, and I am 35 years old. Today marks one of the darkest chapters of my life. Just yesterday, I laid my husband Michael to rest in a cemetery thousands of miles from home, in Singapore. After spending more than 30 hours on planes and in airports trying to get back to Seattle, I was completely drained. Every muscle in my body ached, and my eyes burned from exhaustion and endless tears. When I finally had cell service again, I opened our family group text and typed out a simple message. My flight gets in at 5 in the afternoon. Is anyone able to come get me from the airport? I stared at my phone, hoping, praying for a kind response. My younger sister Amanda was the first to reply. She said, "We have plans already. Maybe you should just call an Uber or something." Then my mom chimed in, asking why I had not figured this out ahead of time. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely type back. I told them not to worry about it, even though inside, I felt like I was crumbling into a million pieces. What I did not realize then was that within just a few hours, everyone in my family would be seeing my personal tragedy splashed across the evening news. Before grief completely rewrote every single page of my existence, I actually had what most people would consider an amazing life. Michael and I first crossed paths during our second year at the University of Washington. He accidentally knocked over his coffee cup, and it spilled all over my economics textbook. He felt so terrible that he insisted on buying me a replacement, and somehow he turned that awkward moment into our first dinner together. We got married right after we graduated and created this beautiful existence in Seattle. I built a career as a marketing director at a tech startup, while Michael excelled as a software engineer for a major company. We bought this adorable 2-story house with a backyard where I spent every spring planting vegetables and flowers. Michael used to tease me constantly, saying my tomatoes were so perfect they could win blue ribbons at the state fair if I ever bothered to enter them. 10 wonderful years of marriage flew by like the most beautiful dream you never want to wake up from. We traveled whenever we could save up enough vacation days. Every Thursday night, we hosted game nights with our closest friends. We were diligently putting money aside, planning for our future together. Michael and I had started talking seriously about having children. We had even started converting our extra bedroom, which we used as an office, into what would eventually become a nursery when we felt the time was right. Then, everything shifted dramatically last autumn when Michael received an offer for a 6-month contract position with this prestigious international technology company based in Singapore. This opportunity was literally the chance of a lifetime, the kind of career advancement that Michael had been working toward for years. It would also give us the incredible experience of living in another country together. I managed to arrange things with my company so I could work remotely for 3 months, and we made plans to split our time between 2 continents. We were both so incredibly excited about this new adventure waiting for us. The night before Michael had to leave for Singapore, we prepared this special dinner at home. I can still remember every single detail of that evening with perfect clarity. There was soft jazz music playing quietly in the background. Candles flickered on our dining room table, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The way Michael looked into my eyes when he promised me that this opportunity would make our future even brighter, even more secure. He told me that 6 months would pass by in the blink of an eye, and his fingers were intertwined tightly across the table. He said that once this contract was finished, we would begin the next chapter of our lives together. For the first 2 months, we video called each other every single day without fail. I flew out to visit him for 3 weeks around the holiday season, and honestly, it felt like a second honeymoon all over again. Singapore was absolutely stunning, so vibrant and full of life and excitement. Michael took me all around the city, showing me his favorite spots. He introduced me to everyone he worked with. On the weekends, we took trips to explore neighboring islands. Everything felt absolutely perfect between us. We even began having serious, detailed conversations about trying for a baby as soon as his contract ended. Then came the phone call that completely shattered my entire world into pieces. I was back home in Seattle when Michael mentioned during our morning video chat that he had this really severe headache. He said it was probably just from stress, and he kept massaging his temples with his fingers. He told me he had this big project deadline coming up at work. 8 hours after we hung up, one of his coworkers called me from Michael's phone. My husband had collapsed right in the middle of a meeting and had been rushed to the hospital in an ambulance. I immediately booked the very first available flight I could find, but by the time I finally arrived, 26 hours later, Michael was already in a coma. The doctors explained to me through translators that it was a brain aneurysm. They had performed emergency surgery, but the damage was absolutely catastrophic, beyond what they could repair. For 5 agonizing days, I sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand in mine, talking to him about everything and nothing, praying desperately for a miracle that never came. Michael never regained consciousness, not even for a moment. He was only 37 years old. The absolute nightmare of dealing with a foreign hospital system all by myself was completely overwhelming. Every form I had to fill out was confusing and complicated. Every conversation had to go through translation apps on my phone or through hospital interpreters who were always in a hurry. I called my family back home every single day, desperate for emotional support, for someone to tell me everything would somehow be okay. But our conversations were always brief and rushed. They would tell me they were praying for me, and then they would explain why they had to get off the phone so quickly. My mother actually asked me if I had thought to purchase travel insurance before the trip. My sister Amanda suggested that I should hire a local service to handle all the arrangements so I could just come home sooner and not have to deal with everything. But I could not leave Michael there. Not like that. Not alone in a country where the only people he knew were his coworkers. So I stayed and handled absolutely everything by myself. The paperwork required for his death certificate took 3 complete days and countless trips to different government offices, arranging for Michael to be buried in Singapore because the costs of transporting his body all the way back home were so prohibitively expensive that I simply could not afford it, required me to navigate completely unfamiliar customs and traditions that I knew nothing about. The funeral service was small and heartbreaking. Some of his coworkers came. A few expat friends he had made showed up. And me. There was no other family there. None of our lifelong friends. My parents told me the flight was just too expensive on such short notice. My sister Amanda said she had critical obligations at work that she absolutely could not get out of. I stood completely alone as they lowered my husband into the ground on the other side of the world, far away from everyone we had ever loved. The financial strain was absolutely crushing me. Our insurance covered some of the expenses, but international policies had all these limitations I had never even thought to examine before tragedy struck us. I drained every penny from our savings account and maxed out multiple credit cards just to pay for everything. Through all of this, I kept updating my family constantly, hoping desperately that someone would offer more than just brief condolences or practical suggestions. Looking back now, I should not have been surprised at all by how they responded to my text about needing a ride from the airport. My family had always operated exactly this way for my entire life. When I graduated from high school as valedictorian, my parents did attend the ceremony, but they left immediately right after my speech was finished because they had to get my sister to her volleyball game. At my college graduation, they showed up late and left early. Even at my wedding, my mother spent more time fussing over Amanda bringing the wrong boyfriend than she did celebrating my marriage to Michael. I had spent my entire life making accommodations for their priorities, making excuses for their behavior over and over again, and telling myself that different families just have different ways of showing love. But standing at my husband's grave on the other side of the planet, I finally understood with complete clarity that some people simply do not have the capacity to put others first, even in moments of desperate, urgent need. After the funeral service was over, an entirely new nightmare began for me. The Singaporean bureaucracy required multiple certified copies of death certificates, and each one needed to be authenticated at different government offices that were spread all across the city. I spent 3 days traveling back and forth between buildings in the oppressive tropical heat, standing in endless lines, trying to explain my situation through grief-choked words that barely made sense. Each night, I collapsed in the apartment Michael and I were renting, surrounded by his clothes that still smelled exactly like him. On my final morning in Singapore, I went to visit Michael's grave one last time before heading to the airport. The cemetery was so peaceful at dawn, with birds singing in the lush trees overhead. I placed fresh flowers beside his simple headstone and sat down on the dewy grass, telling him everything I was bringing home with me. His favorite books that he always kept on his nightstand, the watch I had given him for our 5th anniversary, the collection of seashells we had gathered together during our weekend trips to nearby beaches. I whispered to him, pressing my palm flat against the cool marble of his headstone, that I would keep him alive in my heart every single day for the rest of my life. My journey back home stretched over 30 brutal hours. First, there was a 6-hour delay in Singapore because of mechanical issues with the plane. Then I missed my connection in Tokyo, which required an overnight stay in an airport hotel where I barely slept. The final leg of the journey included turbulence so severe that the flight attendants had to remain seated for 2 straight hours. By the time we finally began our descent into Seattle, I had been traveling for more than a day straight. I had barely eaten anything. I was running purely on grief and sheer determination to just get home. During those endless travel hours, my mind kept circling back to childhood memories, and I started seeing patterns I had always excused before. When I was 8 years old, I broke my arm falling from the backyard treehouse. My parents took me to the emergency room, but then they left me there with our neighbor to wait for x-rays while they took Amanda to her championship soccer game. My mother explained that Amanda could not miss it because the whole team was counting on her. When I earned a full scholarship to my dream college, my father's very first question was whether it would cost them anything out of pocket. He reminded me that Amanda had expensive sports camps that summer. He said college was my choice, so I should handle the finances myself. I worked 2 jobs between all my classes while Amanda attended an out-of-state university that was fully funded by our parents. On my wedding day, my mother spent the whole time criticizing my dress as impractical, and my father complained constantly about the cost of our modest venue. Amanda showed up an hour late to the actual ceremony. Michael had noticed their behavior from the very beginning, but he gently encouraged me to focus on our happiness, instead of trying to change them. He told me we could not change other people, but we could choose how much power we gave them over our joy. Throughout all the funeral arrangements in Singapore, I had called home almost every single day. Most of my calls went straight to voicemail. When someone actually did answer, the conversations were always brief and focused on when I would be returning rather than how I was actually coping with everything. My mother suggested that I was dwelling on my grief by staying for the funeral rather than simply having Michael cremated immediately so I could come home faster. Amanda asked if Michael had life insurance before expressing concern about a work presentation she was struggling with. Despite this entire history, some completely irrational part of me still believed that this tragedy, the absolute worst moment of my entire life, would finally bring out the compassion I had always craved from my family. Surely they would recognize the magnitude of my loss and respond with the support I so desperately needed. 3 days before my final flight home, I sent a message to our family group chat with all my itinerary details spelled out clearly. The responses I got were minimal, just thumbs-up emojis from both of my parents, and Amanda asking if I was bringing back any souvenirs from Singapore. I clarified my exact arrival time 2 more times before I boarded my final flight, hoping desperately that someone would offer to meet me at the airport. Nobody did, but I made one last attempt as our plane finally touched down on American soil. My sister Amanda's response that they were busy and I should try Uber felt like an actual physical blow to my chest. My mother asking why I had not planned better made me question whether I had ever truly mattered to them at all. In that moment, sitting in that cramped airplane seat, surrounded by passengers who were all eager to get off and reunite with their families, I made a silent promise to Michael and to myself. This would be the very last time I expected water from an empty well. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was buzzing with afternoon activity as I made my way through customs. The harsh fluorescent lighting hurt my eyes after so many sleepless nights, and every announcement over the PA system made me physically flinch. I navigated through the crowded terminal on complete autopilot. My body was present, but my mind remained thousands of miles away with Michael. I stood at the baggage claim area, watching suitcases circle endlessly on the conveyor belt. Mine were easy to identify. One large black suitcase contained my clothes, and two others were packed completely full with Michael's possessions, the things I could not bear to leave behind in Singapore. His favorite sweater that he wore constantly, the leather journal I had given him last Christmas, photo albums filled with our memories, the coffee mug he used every single morning. These fragments of our life together now represented everything I had left of him. My phone buzzed with another message in the family group chat. I opened it, hoping against hope that someone had reconsidered and decided to come get me. Amanda wrote that seriously, they could not rearrange their schedules at the last minute, and that this was why planning ahead exists. Mom added that she and my father had dinner with the Henderson family that night, and they had responded yes weeks ago. Dad said the forecast was calling for rain later, and I should drive carefully when I got home. I stared at the screen as this familiar, hollow feeling spread through my entire chest. Not even a single question about how I was actually doing or whether I had arrived safely. No acknowledgement whatsoever of what I had just been through for the past 2 weeks. I typed back a simple message saying, "No worries, I understand." But I did not understand at all. How could dinner plans or social obligations possibly outweigh the need to support your daughter, who had just buried her husband alone on the other side of the world? The weight of all the suitcases made me stagger as I loaded them onto an airport cart. Michael's possessions suddenly felt impossibly heavy, both physically and emotionally. As I struggled toward the exit, one of the wheels on the cart got stuck and the top suitcase went crashing to the ground. It burst open, spilling Michael's clothes all across the polished airport floor. I dropped to my knees right there in the middle of the airport, frantically gathering his belongings as tears blurred my vision completely. A blue sweater that still smelled like him, his favorite running shoes, the tie he always wore to fancy dinners. Each item I touched unleashed fresh waves of grief that threatened to drown me. A voice said, "Let me help you with that." An airport employee knelt down beside me, gently collecting the scattered items. Her name tag read Gloria. She had these kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she looked at me. She asked if I was all right. That simple question broke something deep inside me. When was the last time someone had actually asked if I was okay? Not how soon I would get over it or what practical steps I needed to take next, but simply whether I was all right. I whispered that my husband had died and that I had just buried him in Singapore. Gloria's expression softened with genuine compassion. She helped me repack the suitcase in complete silence, then personally escorted me all the way to the rideshare pickup area. She asked if someone was coming to get me. I shook my head and told her no, my family was busy. Her frown spoke absolute volumes, but she did not make any comments. Instead, she waited right there with me until my rideshare arrived, helped load all my luggage into the trunk, and squeezed my hand tightly before I got in the car. She told me to take care of myself. It was more genuine comfort than my own family had offered in weeks. The rideshare ended up costing $78 because of rush hour surge pricing. The driver, an older man named Paul, made polite conversation as we sat in heavy traffic. When he asked about my trip, I gave him vague answers because I was terrified I would completely shatter if I spoke the truth out loud. He seemed to sense my distress and turned on soft music instead, occasionally pointing out changes to the city that had happened in recent months. After nearly an hour stuck in traffic, we finally pulled into my driveway. The house looked exactly the same as I had left it, yet somehow completely different at the same time. Michael would never again open that front door, never again pull into this driveway, never again complain about the maple tree dropping seeds that clogged up the gutters. Paul helped carry all my luggage up to the porch. As he set down the last bag, he hesitated for a moment. He said I seemed like I might need someone, and he asked if I was sure I was okay. I assured him I was fine, gave him a generous tip, and watched his taillights disappear down the street before I fumbled with my house keys. The door swung open to reveal a cold, completely dark interior. I had asked my mother to please adjust the thermostat the day before my arrival. She had apparently forgotten entirely. Inside the house, stale air greeted me. Mail overflowed from the basket sitting by the door, another task my family had promised to handle but clearly ignored. The refrigerator contained only expired condiments and a container of something so moldy I could not even identify what it used to be. My sister had assured me she would stock basic necessities before I got back home. I was too exhausted to deal with any of it. I dragged myself upstairs to our bedroom. I could not bear to sleep in our bed, so I curled up in the armchair by the window, still wearing my coat because the house was so incredibly cold. Surrounded by photographs of happier times, I finally allowed myself to break down completely. I woke up hours later, completely disoriented and shivering violently. The house was silent in a way it had never been when Michael was alive. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no coffee maker gurgling downstairs in the kitchen, no off-key humming coming from the shower, just emptiness and the occasional creak of settling wood. Michael's closet door stood partially open, revealing all the clothes he had left behind when he went to Singapore. My family had promised to organize his belongings to make my return home easier. Inside, I found absolutely everything untouched. His shoes were still lined up precisely as he'd left them. His favorite flannel shirt still hung on the hook where he'd placed it the morning he left. Every single item exactly where it had been 6 months ago, preserved like some kind of museum exhibit to the life we once had together. I sank down to the floor of the closet, pulling his shirt into my arms, desperately searching for any lingering trace of his scent. There was nothing left, just clean cotton and the faint mustiness of a space that had been closed up for too long. I had carried pieces of him across the entire ocean, only to find that the pieces I had left behind no longer felt like him at all. Morning arrived with this strange gurgling sound coming from somewhere downstairs. Stiff from sleeping in the chair all night, I made my way down to investigate. The noise grew louder and louder as I approached the kitchen. When I flipped on the light switch, I actually gasped out loud in horror. Water was pouring from a massive crack in the ceiling, cascading down the walls and pooling all across the tile floor. The temperature in the house had dropped even further overnight, and I could literally see my breath clouding in front of me. I splashed through 3 inches of ice-cold water to reach the utility closet where the main water shutoff valve was located. The metal wheel was so cold, it actually burned my fingers as I struggled to turn it. After several attempts, the flow of water finally stopped, but the damage was already extensive. When everything goes wrong, the pipe must have frozen solid and then burst during the recent cold snap. If someone had maintained proper heating in the house like they promised, this never would have happened. I stood there in my completely waterlogged kitchen, staring at the destruction all around me, feeling oddly detached from reality. After everything else that had happened, this almost seemed darkly comical. Of course, my homecoming would include a flooded house. Outside, the temperature was dropping rapidly as another winter storm approached the area. The local news had been warning about it for days, according to all the notifications stacked up on my phone. My family must have known about the forecast when they suggested I drive carefully. Yet not a single one of them had thought to ensure the house was properly winterized or heated. I called an emergency plumber, only to be told they were backed up for days because of similar issues all across the city. The dispatcher explained apologetically that they were looking at Tuesday at the earliest because the storm had everyone calling in with burst pipes. My next call was to my sister. Amanda answered on the fourth ring, and her voice sounded distracted. She said she could not really talk right then because she was getting ready for dinner with the Wilson family that she had mentioned before. I said flatly that the house was flooded, a pipe had burst, there was water everywhere, and the plumber could not come until Tuesday. Amanda replied that it sucked, but she sounded more annoyed than concerned. She asked if I had tried calling other plumbers, maybe checking online reviews or something. I told her I had just gotten back from burying my husband. I had been traveling for more than a day straight. I could not stay in this house. There was water in the electrical fixtures, and there was no heat at all. I asked if I could possibly stay with her until this got sorted out. The silence that followed told me absolutely everything before she even spoke. She said that actually tonight was really bad timing. She and her boyfriend had these clients coming over that she had been trying to land for months, and their guest room was full of her crafting supplies right then. She suggested I should call mom and dad. I ended that call and immediately tried my parents next. My mother answered the phone with immediate excuses pouring out. She said, "Oh, honey, you know we would normally say yes in a heartbeat, but her bridge club was meeting at their house the next day, and they had spent all day preparing for it. Plus, my father's back had been acting up again. They just could not handle having guests right then." She asked, "What about a hotel?" and said I should have insurance for that sort of thing. By this point, I had not eaten a proper meal in over 24 hours. The international travel, the grief, and now this crisis had left me physically depleted. I felt lightheaded and nauseated as I tried to navigate through the flooded kitchen to find anything edible. The power flickered ominously as the storm outside intensified. I managed to locate a package of stale crackers in a cupboard and ate them mechanically while standing in water that had now soaked completely through my shoes and socks. My extremities were beginning to go numb from the cold, but I could not seem to make myself care enough to find dry clothes. Everything felt distant and unimportant. In a last desperate attempt to fix something, anything at all, I decided to check the electrical panel down in the basement to see if I could at least get some heat working in part of the house. The basement stairs were slick with water, and I gripped the railing tightly as I made my way down into the darkness. The musty space was partially flooded, with water reaching up to my ankles. I sloshed toward the electrical panel on the far wall, using my phone's flashlight to guide me through the dark. As I reached for the panel door, my foot slipped on the wet concrete. I fell forward hard, and my hand instinctively shot out to brace against the metal box. A sharp jolt of electricity shot through my entire arm, throwing me backward violently. My head struck something hard as I fell, and for a moment, everything went completely dark. I came to on the cold basement floor, completely disoriented and shivering violently. My right arm was tingling painfully from the electrical shock, and something warm was trickling down the side of my face. When I touched my temple with my fingers, they came away red with blood. The fall had left a gash just above my eyebrow. Struggling to my feet, I felt this wave of dizziness wash over me. The basement seemed to tilt and spin around me as I staggered toward the stairs. Each step required immense concentration. Halfway up, I had to stop and just sit down because my vision was blurring at the edges. By the time I reached the main floor again, I was barely conscious. I collapsed onto the sofa in the living room, completely unable to go any further. The house had grown even colder, and I could no longer feel my fingers or toes at all. Some distant part of my mind recognized these as symptoms of hypothermia setting in, but I simply could not summon the energy to care anymore. As I drifted in and out of consciousness, a high-pitched beeping sound penetrated through the fog in my brain. The carbon monoxide detector was going off. Something was wrong with the heating system, perhaps damaged by all the water or malfunctioning because of the storm. Toxic gas was filling the house while I lay there, incapacitated, unable to reach for help. My phone was sitting on the coffee table, just inches from my hand, yet it might as well have been miles away. My limbs refused to cooperate, and darkness was creeping in at the edges of my vision. In what I believed might be my final conscious moments, this strange calm settled over me. If this was how it all ended, at least I would be with Michael again. At least all the pain would finally stop. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness completely was the sound of someone pounding hard on the front door and a voice calling out my name. Then there was nothing but darkness. I later learned that my neighbor, Diane Foster, who lives across the street, had noticed water flowing out from under my front door and down the porch steps. Concerned, she had tried calling my phone first, and then she came over to investigate in person. When nobody answered her knocks, but she could hear the carbon monoxide alarm blaring loudly inside, she immediately called 911. The firefighters had to break down my door to get inside. They found me unconscious on the sofa. The house was dangerously cold and partially flooded, with carbon monoxide levels well above the safety threshold. According to the paramedics who transported me to Seattle General Hospital, I was suffering from moderate hypothermia, carbon monoxide poisoning, a concussion, and the effects of an electrical shock. One of them reportedly told the emergency room doctor that a few more hours and they would have been looking at a very different outcome. What happened next became the moment when karma finally caught up with my family's years of neglect. A local reporter named Michael Chen was at the hospital that evening, covering storm-related injuries for the news. He overheard a paramedic discussing my case in the break room. The bizarre series of tragedies that led to a newly widowed woman being found near death in her own home was too compelling a story to ignore. By that evening, my story had made it onto the local news. The report detailed how I had buried my husband in Singapore, traveled over 30 hours to return home, been denied basic support from family members, and then nearly died due to a preventable household emergency. Screenshots of our text exchange, shared by someone at the hospital, spread rapidly across social media. The contrast between my simple request and my family's dismissive responses struck a deep chord with viewers. That is when justice finally arrived. The community responded with overwhelming support. Local businesses offered free services. Most importantly, my family's carefully maintained image of loving support crumbled under public scrutiny. When they finally showed up at the hospital, it was not out of genuine concern, but to do damage control for their reputations. For the first time in my life, I set firm boundaries. I told them I was choosing to prioritize my healing over maintaining our family's image. I chose to surround myself with genuine support rather than obligation disguised as care. 3 months later, I established the Michael Henderson Memorial Scholarship for International Education, turning my pain into something meaningful. On what would have been our 11th anniversary, I hosted a gathering to announce the first scholarship recipient. My family sent regrets, citing prior commitments, but I was surrounded by real friends, people who had actually shown up when showing up mattered most. The greatest lesson I learned from this experience is that family is not just about blood. It's about who shows up in your darkest moments. Your worth is not determined by others' capacity to recognize it. Sometimes the people we expect to be there simply cannot provide what we need, and that is not a failure on our part. If I could offer advice to anyone in a similar situation, it would be this. Do not wait for people to change who have shown you repeatedly who they are. Set boundaries that protect your healing. Remain open to unexpected sources of kindness, And remember that choosing yourself is not selfish, it's survival. The karma that caught up with my family was not dramatic or vengeful. It was simply the truth becoming public and them having to face the consequences of their choices. Meanwhile, I discovered that real family can be created and chosen, built not by obligation, but by genuine care and showing up when it matters most.